Okay. Anyway, our endangered species team is doing really important work to protect the most imperiled invertebrates that we know of: freshwater mussels, fireflies, bumblebees, monarch butterflies, and so forth. We have a lot of amazing staff. If you are interested in urban pollinator conservation work, if you're interested in kind of pesticide policy and best practices, go to our website, check out some of our programs. I have amazing coworkers. So, but to tell you a little bit more about, let's see here, advanced slide, that got stuck. I don't know if that's something that I did, but all right, here we go. To tell you a little bit more about my particular position is that my position is funded by a partnership between NRCS, Xerces, and General Mills. So I'm essentially like a contract biologist to the USDA NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. That's the branch of the USDA that's responsible for helping farmers with conservation. So my audience is private landowners, farmers, conservation staff, helping all of you with technical support as it pertains to pollinators and beneficial insects. I can get out on the ground and do habitat evaluations. I can help with conservation planning. I do a lot of field days and outreach like this. And then in this year in particular, I've been doing a lot of refining of technical documents, so many seed mixes, reviewing seed mixes and that kind of thing. So the bottom line is that I am here to assist you. I work, and by the way, I'm based in southeastern Minnesota, but I cover Minnesota and Wisconsin. So reach out. Okay, so to get into the bulk of the talk here, the primary focus is going to be to introduce you to this technical guide that the Xerces Society put together. It's called Maintaining Diverse Stands of Wildflowers Planted for Pollinators. It is a document that's national in scope, but I think the tools that are inside this, the evaluation tools, monitoring tools, even the management strategies are really relevant, whether or not it's the upper Midwest, driftless area, or mid-Atlantic, or even Oregon. So this is available on our website for free as a downloadable PDF. And the way I'm gonna organize this talk is basically to walk through the guide as if we all were looking at it. So you can go find this on the website after the talk. And so it's helpful to start by defining our terms and understanding what we all mean by functional pollinator habitat. And the way we think of it is that functional habitat has a diversity of desirable pollinator attractive plants. None of the species are dominating the planting. There's successive blooms throughout the season and an abundance of blooms, not just a few here and there. No plant is, there's some evenness. There's the dominant plants. There are native species, not weeds. And they stand the test of time. They occur year after year. So there are some other things, some central kind of tenets here that I just want to kind of drill into your mind so that we're all sharing the same kind of perspective about what we're looking for. So diversity in your planting, whether that's from the initial seed mix or as you manage over time, will provide all of these important benefits, such as greater functionality for wildlife, soil health, water interception and infiltration. Diverse plantings are more resistant to plant invasion, and they stand the test of time. They stand longevity. And this is a slide that I would normally put in like a seed mix design workshop, but I think it's important even here to give you some perspective of what is needed in a diverse plant community. Even in pollinator plantings where the bulk of the species might be wildflowers, we still need these other components to make them resilient to invasive species. We need the grasses, not just, we need a diversity of warm season, cool seasons, and sedges and rushes. Just like Rich was showing in his talk, we need these different kinds of forbs that have short life cycles, long life cycles, some that are even parasitic on each other. Those are all important functional groups in the planting. And of course, because this is promoting pollinators, we do need abundant flowers throughout the season. And I think evenness is really critical. So when I'm evaluating seed mixes, often I find that one of the weaknesses of seed mixes for pollinators is that they're light on early season blooms. And that's usually a factor of cost. Spring blooming species tend to be more expensive. But when we're either designing the mix and or managing long-term, we really need just as many abundant blooms in the spring as we do in the fall. And when we're designing for pollinators specifically, we need to include a diversity of plant families in the planting. And that is so that we are catering to both the generalist and the specialist species that are out there that we're trying to attract. There are a couple different plant families that are kind of like heavy hitters in terms of hosting a lot of specialists. The aster family, legumes, and willows are really important plant families for specialist species. But there are a lot of different plant families and even plant genera out there that host really unique bees. And I put up the native loosestrife Lysomachia up there just as an example because it hosts this bee species that's becoming kind of rare, Macropus, which collects floral oils from this type of, from this genus of plant. And this is a common kind of genus in natural areas, but I don't often see it included in restoration plantings. And so this is just an invitation to you to diversify the plant families, because when you do that, you will bring in a lot of different specialized pollinator species. Okay, so that's kind of the central principles of what functional habitat looks like. And now let's say you're in maybe year 3, 4, or 5 of a restoration planting. You've already got it somewhat established and you're starting to ask yourself questions about how this planting is performing. Are the species that you put in the mix showing up? Are there weedy species dominating still? Is there species blooming throughout the season? Are there problematic species that you have to address? And when you start to ask these questions, then we'll go through this framework that will help you figure out how to manage, to find the answers to those questions. So this leads me to this framework that's outlined in the guide, the Maintaining Diverse Stands of Wildflowers. The first is to monitor your planting. So this is after a few years in, right? It's already established, and you start to go out a few times a year and monitor. Maybe this is every month, or maybe it's 3 times a month or 3 times a year, and you're finding out what species are showing up, and kind of like a yearly data collection. The second phase is to do this kind of over a few years and then group that data together and evaluate what you're finding, kind of longer term trends over a few years. And that information will give you some ideas about how to manage your planting. And then the fourth phase is to actually implement that management and evaluate the impacts of the management. And then it cycles through. And for each one of these stages, there's some data forms that accompany this guide that we have for you. So these are blank sheets, and I realize you can't read all of this, so I'm just going to kind of highlight them, and then a few of them I'm going to go through in examples. But basically, the first one is an installation plan. That's where you document what happened, what was the site prep, what are the species in your mix. The second data form is a monitoring form. So that's where you list the species that were in your mix, and you start to collect data on how abundant they are, when they're blooming, and that kind of thing. The third form is an evaluation form, and that's where you're accumulating the data from years of monitoring, and you're seeing the trends in abundance of different species. And the fourth form is a habitat management log. So that's where you're writing down what management you actually did, and then recording kind of the effect of that management. So those are all up online for free as well. So this is an example of that monitoring form, and there's a lot going on here. Maybe I'll show you. So I blew up the key on the bottom of the screen there, where it shows there's like the form. Is this species in your mix a forb or a grass, or is it a shrub? You just circle that. That kind of helps you figure out your composition. Is that species blooming at the time of your monitoring? And then abundance is kind of a simple breakdown. Is it an abundant species in terms of cover? Is it over 50% of cover at the time of monitoring? Or is it just common, 10 to 50%? Is it rare, less than 10%? Or is it not even present? So that's where you want to write down your entire mix and figure out which species are not even showing up, right? This is the flip side of the same document or the same data form, where you're documenting your unwanted species that are going to show up, that it always happens, right? You want to figure out what's there, when is it blooming, what percent cover is it taking up in the planting, and is it a really problematic species? Once you do that, you collect all the kind of the data from that, add it up, and you'll have kind of this series of data sheets about what's happening during that growing season. Now, the second form, this is the evaluation form, where you kind of collect all the data that was collected in your monitoring forms, and you pool it over several years. So you can see here, there's the desirable species on the left in the blue area, and then on the right, it's the species abundance by year. So what you can see, and this is obviously a West Coast kind of example, but California poppy, right? It was a very abundant in 2013, in 2014, in 2015, and so forth. It's just become common. And so this is where you can start to see your data trends in terms of each species and see how you want to manage from here on out. Okay, so we're getting to the third phase, and this is where you've monitored, you've evaluated, and now you want to consider what management techniques to use. So I'd encourage you to set your goals, and of course you're going to want to suppress unwanted weedy species. You're going to want to maintain or enhance diversity, but I'd encourage you to articulate specifically what your goals are. And now I'm going to go through a few of some of those management techniques that you might employ in your plantings. The first of which is maybe kind of the easiest to get your head around, is just reducing the threat of some of the weeds that are there. That can be hand weeding, if that's kind of the ideal scenario if you only have a small problem. Spot spraying or grass selective herbicides, those are all pretty common understood approaches. You might also do mowing for weed control. So this is typical in years 1 and 2 for establishment, but you might not realize you might be doing weed control like this ongoing for the life of your planting, depending on what kinds of unwanted species you have present. You might be mowing certain areas annually. You might be doing it multiple times. You have certain really troublesome perennial species that you're trying to get rid of, and you're not inclined to use herbicides for one reason or another. Then the key here is when you're mowing, know your target weeds' life history, because some of them are of course stimulated by mowing. You may also want to mow for diversity goals. And so with most of our management practices here, I'm going to recommend mowing, or whatever the technique is, doing it in patches so that you're leaving some refugia for invertebrates. It's just the best practice to recommend. You'll want to mow for kind of target timing to reduce the dominant species that you have present. Flail mowing is always better than kind of using a hay machine, because then it will disperse that litter and it'll break it down faster. If you have rare species in your area, especially in the driftless area where there might be rusty patch bumblebees, it's recommended to mow pretty high so that you're avoiding bumblebee nests. And of course, with all the practices that you use for management, you want to be mapping those areas. Conservationhane is really similar. It suppresses woody vegetation, just like a lot of these management practices. And importantly, it removes the litter, right? And so it reduces light competition from those tall grasses. It allows spring blooming and shorter blooming species to thrive. The picture on the left here is an example from a Conservationhane project that we did in just kind of east of the Twin Cities. And it was just stunning to see the lupins and the spring blooming species really thrive in those hayed patches. And importantly, in a lot of these reconstructions and restoration plantings that are coming in on former ag land, there may be excessive nitrogen in the soils, and haying may be a good way to remove that nitrogen, take it offsite, so that you're favoring the natives and not allowing those weedy species to thrive. Of course, prescribed fire can be a really useful tool as well to open up those pollinator habitats. And with fire comes best management practices. And yeah, I just want to kind of harken on this, is that in the driftless area, especially, we have, fortunately, so many rare species that we're still learning about. And it is wise to do a survey ahead of time to find out what's present on your site or maybe around the site, to figure out if you need to be especially cautious with your management techniques. So burn only a third of the habitat if you can. If you have bumblebees on site that are rare, burning in the dormant season is advised. And then if you want to be adding other seeds, kind of interseeding like Rich was mentioning, after fire. And this is not in the guide, but I did want to put it up here. This is from a fact sheet from the Iowa NRCS. I just think it's useful because, like Rich was saying, fire at different times of year has different effects on the plant community. And so, you know, fire in the winter has certain effects. And then if you're really trying to target cool season grasses, you may want to burn in the spring. Of course, there are some downsides for forbs that are getting established, cool season forbs. So anyway, this is just a useful little table that you might want to take a look at in that fact sheet. Conservation grazing is pretty similar in that, you know, this is, okay, so this is different than production grazing in that it implies a lighter stocking rate. Right, so as grazing intensifies, pollinators and pollinator plants tend to decrease. So stocking rate is everything: short duration, long recovery, figure out the palatability of the plants so you're not gonna lose species that are desirable. And I wanna introduce one brief idea where you're kind of combining fire and grazing. Some of you might be familiar with this already, is patch burn grazing. Essentially, it's you have one perimeter fence and no interior fences, and you're sort of managing the grazing by burning one unit each year and rotating that burn unit. So the cattle, usually use cattle in patch burn grazing, they tend to prefer the burned unit because they're constantly going back throughout the season for the fresh regrowth that's more nutritious. And if you get the stocking rate right, they tend to not forage as much in these other units that have had longer time since fire. And so in effect, you get this kind of heterogeneity in the planting area. Stocking rate is everything with this though. So a cool idea for sure. And then I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because one, Rich already did a great job covering it, and also because we have a full guide. But if you want to reintroduce wildflower diversity into your grasslands, we developed this guide, Interceding Wildflowers to Diversify Grasslands for Pollinators. This is a guide that we pulled together based on peer-reviewed research as well as a survey of practitioners in the Midwest. It offers a lot of different ideas, strategies for if you're starting with warm season grasses, cool season grasses, or a mixed grass stand. There's some really great tables for which species are known to be persistent in these interseeding situations. So check that out. You might also try adding wildflower diversity by planting bare root plugs or just bare root plants. You might do this when you have maybe a smaller area or it's cost prohibitive to put certain species in the mix from a seed mix point of view, or you did put those species in the mix and then you got poor germination. Another reason to do bare roots and maybe in clusters would be to make monitoring for those easier if you're trying to create a little nursery area and collect seed from those. You might want to keep them in a clustered area so that you can then disperse them across the site later. So that's another tool you might use. And now we're kind of getting, so that's the overview of the management techniques, right? Now we're getting to how to implement them. So this is a lot here. I just want you to focus on this column on the left. After doing your monitoring and evaluation, you're going to decide, what category am I in? What is my planting dominant? Are the desirable species dominant in my planting? Is it a mix of species, or is it mostly unwanted species in my planting? And deciding that for your planting is going to help you decide how to go to which of some of these decision trees in the guide. So this is the decision tree for the planting that's mostly desirable species. And it'll ask you some questions that'll lead you kind of down a path that will eventually suggest some management techniques that I just went over. So obviously some of these examples aren't necessarily Midwest dependent, like lacy Phacelia, that's not really a native species in the Midwest. But the point is still that if you have high value wildflowers, these are some of the techniques you might want to use. Or if you ended up in one of these other decision trees, like you have mixed species, some of them are unwanted, some of them are wanted. Are they in patches or are they intermixed? How would you, so it kind of walks you through these different management techniques. One would be this is the third decision tree, if you have mostly unwanted species, are they mixed, are they mostly forbs and so forth. Obviously this is cut off, so there's more information in the guide. And then once you've decided on the management techniques that you want to go with, then you write down in the management log what you decided to do and what the effect was. What was the goal of what you were doing, and what changes should you make in the long term? And then finally, I guess I know I'm rushing through this, but I just want to say, management is a moving target. It's adaptive. You might be doing some of these practices kind of not in the really formulaic way that we lay out in this guide, but I do encourage you to check out the guide, think about the data sheets, see if you want to modify them a little bit for your own purposes. It's really thorough. And a great way for collecting data long-term. So check this out. Doing this ongoing management is more cost-effective than starting over. So that's the main message I want to leave you with. I want to just remind you that we have so many awesome resources in our publications library on our website. This year, we've really ramped up our YouTube site. So there's a lot of really great webinars and talks from my coworkers up there. You can follow us on social media for some little tidbits as well. And my time's probably up. So that's where I'm at. And thank you, everybody, for thinking about this, engaging in this work, and being our partners. I think that's all.
That was fabulous. Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking through the chat, and we have about we have 7 minutes. We'll probably stop this one at like 7 after 1 o'clock, so we can move over to the next one. So we have about 5 minutes for Q&A. And there was a question about one of your slides. I believe it was this slide, Karin, that had the dates of burning. That I did share the references that you had wanted to get shared. If it's in one of those, that's fine. If there's another one.
Okay, I am trying to advance my slides or change them. For some reason, it's just, let's go, I'll just do it this way. Okay, there we go. Oops. There you go.
Yeah. Is there actually any of us can screen share? We can print this, do a screenshot. But is there some information related to this in a publication of sorts, or one that?
Yeah, I mean, for some reason I can't find the chat box right now. So if you did share that link to the Iowa NRCS fact sheet, It will, I mean, I just pulled this out of context, right? So there is a little bit of information. I don't know exactly the data set that they used to pull this information together, but I would use this as a loose guide and monitor your own planting and find out if this is really true. But I think there's some intuition that makes sense for some of these figures for me.
And then I have a question particular about burning or mowing and the presence of species that we are concerned about. Is there a certain time, like we do know with grassland bird nests, we have these windows of time that we should and should not be mowing or doing even herbicide application? Is there a period of time that we need to be aware of, or is that very specific to the species that are there?
Shoot, I removed an important slide that I would have been able to answer this question, at least for monarchs. There's some really good data about monarchs best practices for mowing, and it's based, I don't have the link available, but if you look at the Monarch Joint Venture fact sheets, you can find best practices for mowing. And I think it might even be couched in like a right-of-way fact sheet for land managers that way. But there's this small window in the middle of the summer where there would be the least impact on larval monarchs. Basically, you don't want to be mowing a lot of the growing season for monarchs. But yeah, I think it's species dependent, and your goals, really, who you're trying to kind of promote in the planting.
And then I have one more, since I have the stage. In terms of those monitoring sheets, I am definitely a fan and proponent for monitoring sites to keep a pulse on how they are doing. If you had a 20-acre site versus a 40-acre, are you modifying, utilizing, say, like a multiple monitoring sheets for sites on different sizes, or how do you all proceed with that?
I probably would put it into units because it might be a little easier to wrap your head around. And because you might be managing different units in different ways. So the guide is for sites, they say explicitly 0.5 to 5 acres. However, I think that 5 acres doesn't need to be so, it could be up to 20 acres. But I think you're right that the bigger the site gets, the more you might want to break it into different tracks that you're monitoring separately.
Excellent. And a question was asked, do you assist with that monitoring data collection, or is that traditionally something that land managers do on their own?
I think I would be able to, I would have the capacity to help with train somebody in, but I don't have the capacity to monitor multiple sites like that.
All right. I'm going to close this down so we can move, we can all walk to the next one.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.